Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest for the next 4 episodes is Simon Ralston. Simon is an instructor in the Department of English at Langara College in Vancouver, British Columbia. We'll be discussing his new book called Prison Life Writing: Conversion and the Literary Roots of the U.S. Prison System. Life writing is a literary genre, mainly nonfiction, that, as you might imagine, tells the story of a person's life, including formats such as diaries, memoirs, and autobiographies. Simon's book is part of a life writing series published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, the sponsor of these episodes. In his book, Simon situates life writing squarely in the prison experience. He explores how prison life writing is influenced by institutional constraints, the notion that prisons at one time were intended to convert felons into more productive members of society, and the various ways men and women perceive their own transformations before, during, and after their incarceration. In this first episode, Simon reveals how his own brush with the prison system put him on a path of studying prison life writing. We'll get a primer on what prison life writing is and isn't, and its complicated relationship with resistance literature. All right, Simon Ralston, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So the genesis of this book includes a mix of personal and academic experiences with the criminal justice system. Can you talk about that? How did you become interested in studying prison writing?
Yeah, so it's a bit of an awkward story to tell people, but I guess I did put it out there in the first paragraph or so of my book, so it's fair game. But yeah, when I was a young guy, I guess when I must have been about 18, I got into an altercation with the police in Santa Barbara in California and found myself locked up in Santa Barbara County Jail for several days. And it was an experience that was very unfamiliar to me. It was I actually didn't know what I had. Initially, I didn't know what I was charged with. I was given a jumpsuit and these funny little jelly sandals to wear, and I think they were like bright orange socks, and a bedroll, and marched through the jail and put in my own jail cell with several other people. And a kid, and I should mention also a white kid from Canada. That's was quite a jarring and unexpected experience. I think it's important to mention a white kid from Canada because, as you know, my charges of, I can't remember what the exact charges were, but I had a scuffle with police. That's not an experience, I think, that somebody who is Black, for example, can easily laugh off. Right. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was an experience, not that I laughed it off, but it was afterwards was an experience that I would tell friends about and, describe, and was sort of an interesting part of my life. But it's really important to note that, of course, that's an experience that somebody who's white like me can kind of walk into and out of without serious violence, whether that be, violence at the hands of police or the violence of being incarcerated for a long period of time. Mm-hmm. So that being said, the experience of being incarcerated after I first got over that initial shock of being on the inside, one of the things I noticed that I found quite interesting was the centrality of stories, like the frequency with which the men that I was locked up with would pass the time by telling stories, and stories about their lives. Mm-hmm. Now, these stories were often quite hyperbolic, often really wild and really funny. But the people that I met were excellent storytellers. So, years later, when I was doing my master's degree, I was involved in something called the Edmonton Project, which was this effort to map different reading groups in and around Edmonton and Alberta. And so my instructor at the time said, the professor said, what I'd like you to do is choose a reading group. Like, where's an area where people are reading, where they're sharing stories, that you might be interested in, and you can map that reading experience. So some people looked at, people who were fascinated by romantic fiction. One guy I know did something on Westerns, but I, in part because of my experience of getting locked up, for those few days in Santa Barbara, I was wondering about prisons. So
Mm-hmm.
I managed to get into a maximum security prison called Edmonton Institution, and a jail, provincial jail called Fort Saskatchewan Correctional Center. And in each of those cases, I discussed reading with prisoners. What were they reading? How were books circulated? What did the library look like? And I found it a really fascinating experience. But also, a lot of the men and women who I met were telling me about books that I should read in order to understand what incarceration was like. And perhaps not surprisingly, a lot of those books were written by prisoners or former prisoners. And
Right.
so when I turned to do my PhD and I was thinking about what my focus of my dissertation would be, the thing I immediately turned to, and in fact, one of the reasons why I wanted to do graduate work was to continue looking at the prison system and looking at some of these books that prisoners had recommended to me. So for
Excellent.
me, yeah, that's really the direction that I ended going in, with the dissertation. And then I've really been involved with looking into prison writing and the prison system more broadly since then.
Okay. So the book is called Prison Life Writing. I'm wondering if you can help us understand exactly what life writing is.
Yeah, life writing is an umbrella term that
Mm-hmm.
essentially covers, to put it in very broad strokes, any form of writing, mostly nonfiction, although not exclusively, about somebody's life. That would include obviously autobiography, memoir, letters, diaries, and then maybe less obvious examples like autofiction, where you have a blend of autobiography and fiction. But the idea is that for the most part, the narrator and author are not, I mean, I wouldn't say the same person, but are sharing the same conceptual territory.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're taking that term and applying it in the context of a prison environment then for the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And my focus, I mean, I ended up focusing on monographs and published prisoners' autobiographies and memoirs.
Mm-hmm.
That's partly, I guess, in a way, strategic because there's so much writing in prison that I could focus on. When you think of letters, or you think of, for example, Penn does regular awards for prisoners writing, if it's short fiction, for example, or
Right.
shorter works. So, but also for me, I'm interested in the works that we choose as monographs to enter into public discourse. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a kind of gatekeeping function, obviously, with those kinds of books as well. And so one of the things that fascinated me was how, what are the features of those types of books or those types of monographs that we end up seeing as exemplars of prison life writing.
Okay. So in your introduction, you say that, quote, because there has been no sustained consideration of prison life writing as a genre, scholars, educators, and activists consistently misidentify American prison life writing as, quote, resistance literature, which presumes that the genre has an ideological cohesion that is not entirely accurate. That statement brings a lot of questions to mind. But the first is, could you talk about resistance literature and why prison writing is so often presumed to fit into the genre?
Yeah, so if we think resistance literature, again, to kind of give a very, I mean, horribly broad definition,
Yeah.
would be literature of a group that is of an oppressed group. And resistance literature is literature that's bound up with representing the experience of that oppression and the experience of actively resisting that oppression. So resistance literature, you could think of that in terms of anti-colonial struggles. You could think of resistance literature as revolutionary literature, say from the 60s and 70s by African American resistance groups. Now, prison life writing is very often, well, actually does very often fit within resistance literature because it's literature by imprisoned people who are very often resisting the institution of incarceration, right?
Right.
But also, resistance literature has traditionally been bound up with resistance groups and resistance organizations around the world, but certainly in the United States as well. So if you think of the autobiography of Assata Shakur, for example, Her autobiography, she was with a group called the Black Liberation Army, resisting the oppression of Black people in the United States. And her book is very much bound up with that kind of revolutionary narrative. Same with George Jackson, and same with many other incarcerated people, including Malcolm X, one of the most well-known examples of the prison life writing genre.
So then, does prison life writing have a cohesive ideology?
Yeah, so prison life writing, I would say in some cases it does and it doesn't. So
Yeah.
it's often presumed to have this quality to it that it's inherently resistant, right? So generally people, when they're writing about the life writing, the autobiographies and memoirs of incarcerated people, the presumption is by simply writing that autobiography, they're somehow inherently resisting the institution.
Yeah.
And in many cases, that's true. The institution is trying to define incarcerated people. And very often, life writing is a way for incarcerated people to reclaim some authority over how their life is defined in discourse. So if you think of somebody who's defined discursively through the courts, through their sentencing, and then by the prison in a way as well, through the prison file, for example, the autobiography becomes a way for them to essentially have, in relation to the court, a kind of second hearing. Allows them to write back to power by saying that this is how I would like to be perceived within, a kind of public discourse. So in a sense, it's perfectly understandable to see prison life writing as resistance literature. My resistance to to resistance literature as a term, however, is that it then also hides the ways that prison life writing is not resisting, but is involved in a complex negotiation with power. So involved with a complex negotiation with the prison system, and how rather than seeing the prisoner's autobiography as separate from the prison and writing against it, is actually involved in this, as I describe it, a kind of complex back and forth. So you think, for example, of George Jackson's autobiography. George Jackson was incarcerated initially for, I believe it was car theft, and he got this ridiculous sentence that they used to give people called an indeterminate sentence of essentially 5 years to life. And the idea of an indeterminate sentence is that you get this wide, huge, space of time in prison, and that rather than sort of the sentencing determining how long you're going to be locked up, it's your parole board, right? So, or in California for George Jackson, it was called the Adult Authority. And so the Adult Authority would continuously, check in over the years on George Jackson's performance as a way to determine whether he was, whether he had changed, whether he had changed himself enough to be able to say, yes, this is somebody who deserves to be released. And in a sense, you can kind of understand why that rule makes sense. It allows the incarcerated person an opportunity maybe to get out early if they've demonstrated that they've managed to change their life. But the problem with it is that the parole board really has no reason to let anybody out, but every reason to keep them incarcerated. If someone's let out early, they end up committing a crime, the parole board gets the blame. And so, it becomes incredibly difficult for someone to get let out under this indeterminate sentencing system.
Right.
So George Jackson is in this system, this prison system, when he's writing the letters to family members, letters to his lawyer, and those letters become collected in this book called Soul Dad Brother. Now, most of the time, Soul Dad Brother is understood as an example of revolutionary militancy, of somebody who is fighting tooth and nail against the institution of the prison system, the wider criminal justice system, and even more broadly, the white supremacy of the United States. But what's interesting when you read that book is that very often there is what I've been describing as this complex negotiation between George Jackson and this idea that he needs to transform himself in order to be released from prison. So for a while through his letters, he's, telling family members that he's trying to represent himself as a good boy. He's trying to show that he's rehabilitated, that he's changed in all of the ways that the prison wants him to change. And he's doing that, understandably, strategically, so that he can be released, because it's the only way he's going to get out. And then eventually he realizes that there's really no way for him to be able to represent himself this way. And that is kind of a trick, that he's just not going to get out. And also there's no way for him to be able to represent himself this way and also be a revolutionary and resist the prison system in the way that he would like. And so you see him kind of change and go very much, become very much in line with the militant figure that we all know as George Jackson. So what's happening here with this book is, you see, rather than somebody who is always inherently resistant to the prison system, you have somebody who is working out this complex negotiation in his autobiography as with the prison system, and you see that happening throughout Prisoner's life writings. So my point about saying that prison life writing is not always resistant, and that thinking of it solely as resistance literature kind of misses something really important about the genre, is simply that, that prison life writing is constantly involved in this negotiation, this kind of complex back and forth with the discourse of the institution in which imprisoned people are incarcerated.
Right. Okay. Excellent. You just heard from Simon Ralston. Simon is an instructor in the Department of English at Langara College in Vancouver, British Columbia. And he's the author of Prison Life Writing, Conversion and the Literary Roots of the U.S. Prison System, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, the sponsor of this series. Join us next week for a conversation about the conversion narrative and how it uniquely relates to prison life writing.
One of the things that I'm fascinated with in my book is how you have this institutional narrative of conversion that never really goes away. And then you have prisoners' autobiographies that are also conversion narratives. And then the question is, so what's going on here? Are prisoners' autobiographies that are almost always, or at least men's autobiographies are almost always conversion narratives? How do we understand the ideological work that's going on there if they are repeating the same story? I transformed from one way of being to another, one less desirable to one that is desirable. If they're following that same process, what's the ideological work that's happening there?
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.